Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're having a great day. Pleasure to be with you on this beautiful Monday afternoon. So, there was a few things in the news this week that made me think. The first thing is, yesterday I saw a report that Saeb Erekat, who was the chief negotiator for the Palestinians, and actually he orchestrated the Oslo Accords and has been a vocal critic of Israel over the last so many years, got COVID. And first they left him in his home in the West Bank, but he has a problem. He had a lung transplant and he has many other issues. And his situation was getting critical. And the Palestinian Authority called Israel and asked Israel if he could be moved to a hospital in Jerusalem, Hadassah Hospital. And Israel sent Magen Adom ambulances with an IDF escort to bring him to the hospital in Jerusalem. Unfortunately, he's not doing well. He's in critical condition and it deteriorated overnight. He's on a ventilator and a lot of complications due to his lung transplant. Hopefully he has a speedy recovery. But it was remarkable for me to think about this and to read this. Here was a guy who for years has been bad-mouthing and lambasting and criticizing Israel. At the moment that Israel was able to help him and possibly save his life, and we don't know what's going to happen, Israel didn't hesitate. And there was ministers and Chaver Knesset who said, how could we do that without making them, give something up? Why didn't we get something from them for it? And Israel didn't think. The guy was sick. The guy needed help. Israel was happy to help him. The second thing that happened is yesterday, a 787 Boeing Dreamliner. I took off from Abu Dhabi, came to Israel, picked up dignitaries from Israel, from America, and traveled back, the first official flight, although there was a flight in August, that went to Abu Dhabi to discuss business, to discuss the idea that there'll be 28 weekly flights between Israel and Abu Dhabi. There'll be cargo flights. There's going to be business. And again, a remarkable thing of how Israel, and one of its so-called enemies from the Abrahamic tent, signed an accord called the Abraham Accords and made peace. And it was remarkable. And it reminded me of a speech that I listened to last year in January, I think, from Chief Rabbi Lau, who was the Chief Rabbi of Israel, but by then he's obviously wasn't the Chief Rabbi anymore. He's already, I think, 85 years old, a remarkable man. And he was speaking at an event that Israel made, commemorating 75 years of the liberation of Auschwitz. And dignitaries from all over the world were there. I think Mike Pence was there, and Vladimir Putin was there, and Macron from Paris was there, and the president of Germany was there, and it goes on and on. Dignitaries from all over the world. It was a remarkable event that Israel made to remember and never to forget what happened 75 years earlier and before. And Rabbi Lau spoke as a survivor of Buchenwald, who was 7.5 years old when he was brought to Buchenwald. And he's a remarkable speaker in general, but he said something so powerful, and I want to repeat it to you, because I saw something else that was very painful this weekend. And it's not being reported in the media, of course. And that was the beheading of a teacher in Paris by extreme Muslim terrorists who literally beheaded and planned the beheading of this teacher's life, who was supposed to be a remarkable man, just because they didn't agree with something that he did and his freedom to show a caricature of the Prophet Muhammad or whatever it may be. And it pained me, obviously, very much. And, of course, it didn't help to see the New York Times headline say that police kill person who murders teacher. Instead of just speaking about the teacher being murdered, the headline was skewed. But I want to tell you what Rabbi Lau said, because it's from this week's portion and you're going to love it. First, Rabbi Lau said, he says, 25 years ago, we commemorated 50 years of the liberation of Buchenwald. And I was asked to speak to some of those who survived. And I came to speak, and I said, 50 years ago when I was in Buchenwald, he says, I came as a 7.5-year-old prisoner with no name. I only had a number. And he says the number in Yiddish. He says, a prisoner at 7.5 years old, what did I do? But I had no identity. Today, he says, 50 years later, I come back. I have a country. I have an identity. I'm the chief rabbi of Israel. I have a family, parents, children, grandchildren. I have a name, Israel Meir Lau. So you might think, he says, that I'm going to forgive and forget, that I came here to say, let's start a new chapter. But he says, I want to tell you that I won't forgive and I won't forget. He says, I won't forgive because how could I forgive? It's not my right. When my mother saw me for the last time, as she was ripped away from me, she reminded me to remember I'm always a Jew and to remember I come from 37 generation of rabbis and to continue it as the 38th. But she never told me to forgive. And forget? He says, how could I forget? The hunger, the crying, the pain, watching my mother ripped away. How could I forget? But he said, now I want to speak to you dignitaries here. Now he turns back 75 years since the liberation of Auschwitz in Jerusalem last year. And he says, I want to tell you something. Here stands some of the most powerful leaders in the world who with one stroke of the pen could affect the lives of millions of people. And he says, I appreciate that you came here to call out anti-Semitism and racism. And that's a duty, that's a responsibility, that's a commitment. And we don't take that lightly. But he says, I want to tell you something from Genesis, from the portion of Noach. And he quoted this week's portion. He says, in the portion of Noach, we read of God telling Noach to build a teva, to build an ark. And who goes into the ark? Noach, his wife, his children, his grandchildren, and who else? Every single animal, every single creature. Snakes, scorpions, chimpanzees, lions, cows, sheep. They all go into the teva. And they live there not for 10 days, not for 50 days, not for 100 days, for 150 days. He says, tell me, how could it be that they lived there for 150 days without killing each other? A snake should live together with humans and little children and not hurt anyone? How could it have been that they got along for 150 days without killing each other? He says, you know why? Because they all realized that they had a common enemy, which was the flood. And that if they didn't survive, if they didn't get along together, then they would be out. Noach would throw them out the teva, and there would be no choice. So they were forced by the common enemy, by the common things that were united against them. They were forced to be united and to learn to live together. And then he turned to these leaders. He says, you leaders of the world, who so much depends on you, look at our common enemies. And this was before coronavirus. He said it a month before coronavirus. He says, look at cancer and heart disease and anti-Semitism and racism and hate and murder and religious zealots and extremism. Look at the common enemies. How could we not look at each other and say we have to get along in order to overcome these common enemies? How can we not have the courage to stand up and learn from Noach, and learn from the snake, and learn from the scorpion, and learn from the lion to get along? I thought of these words, how powerful they are. In the world we live in today, which is exasperated so much more since Rabbi Lau got up there only 8 months ago in Jerusalem in front of the dignitaries of the entire world. We're in a world that's infected by a pandemic. There's so much hate. There's so much murder. There's so much killing. Look at what happened in Paris. They beheaded a teacher for what? You read about this teacher, how kind he was, how much the students loved him. How could we not unite for a common goal to get along and to fight, to eradicate death, pandemics, hate, murder? And that's why when I saw the story about Saeb Erekat, you know, the first reaction I always get is, oh, here you go. They talk about apartheid Israel. But meanwhile, how can it be apartheid? Look who we're taking in to look after. Look who we always look after. But then I thought about what Israel did. And I thought about the Abrahamic Accords. And it gave me hope that maybe there are leaders that are listening to what Rabbi Lau's cry was to learn from Noach and to learn from the Teva and to learn from the courage that the animals and all creatures had, to learn to unite and get along, to face adversity and hate and death. May Hashem give us that courage and that vision, especially in this divided election and the friction of our country, to unite in our common goals, to fight against evil and death. God bless you. Have a great day.